I think I'd like to first say thank you for giving us space to raise the views of COSATU on your important work. As COSATU, we were quite pleased when the President established the Commission. I think we're also quite pleased that the President appointed such illustrious or important persons to chair it, which gave us a sense of hope. It's not an easy task you've got, and I think we've been quite happy, for lack of a better word, from what we've seen in the Commission's work, what's been exposed in the media and so on, because it's important to our members to know that the monies are safe and that the issues of corruption, looting, state capture will be dealt with by the state. Chair?
Perhaps, if I can interrupt you here, can you share your disappointment with the committee or the Commission that I believe you were initially informed that the Commission will be finalized by October, November last year. Can you just share that with the Commission?
So Chair, have been involved in this PIC amendment bill at Parliament since September, October 2017. We had already drafted a bill last year. It had gone through the committee processes and so on. I was then called to a meeting with the ANC MPs and the Finance Committee and the former Minister of Finance, Nhlanhla Nene, and Treasury officials, and we were told, look, Treasury and the Minister of Finance, Nhlanhla Nene, were not keen for Parliament to proceed with the PIC bill. Minister Nene's argument is that, look, the PIC Commission has been established in August. This was in August last year, and he anticipated the work to be done around end of October, November, the latest, and then Parliament can then proceed with the bill last year, December. Because we've been involved in politics and know these things, we were shocked that any commission of inquiry can be done within 3 months. Of course, unfortunately, we were proven right when we read in the newspapers that only in December last year was the commission finally given office space and so on. But for us, it was quite a disappointing effort by government to try to stop the bill. We thought it was actually a false ruse because we've been told each stage of the process of Parliament that let's stop for this reason or for that reason. Every month there's a different story. So we didn't buy it and we refused to accept it, Chairperson.
Thank you. You can then please proceed.
No, did you talk about the establishment of the Commission in 2017?
No, the PIC bill at Parliament was first started in September 2017. So, Chair, I think why we wanted to come here today as COSATU was because we know in your terms of reference you're looking at recommendations to the President on the governance of the PIC, and we wanted to kind of share our views with it. Our views were largely captured in the PIC amendment bill that was passed by Parliament in March this year, but we thought, it may be also good just to hear from the horse's mouth, so to speak. So when you make your final recommendations, you would have had the benefit of that. So, Chair, I think the first thing is to say COSATU's interest in the PIC, in the bill, in that we represent 16 different independent trade unions. We have about 1.6 million members. Of course, each person has got about 4 or 5 dependents. We've got about 500,000 former members who are now pensioners. So they have a vested interest in the PIC and its well-being. And of course, I think as you would know very well that 87% of the PIC is the government employees pension fund, about 7% is the unemployment insurance fund, the compensation injury on duty fund, etc. So in short, our view, Chair, is that the PIC is basically workers' monies. We have been quite alarmed by what we have seen in the newspapers over the past few years about looting and mismanagement at the PIC. We have been extremely worried about projected shortfalls in the future in the GPF. So it has a very direct impact upon our workers, Chair. I think, Chair, having said that, also that we're not in a neutral environment. We're in a situation where there's been an explosion of state capture over the years at almost every single parastatal, public service department, public sector entity, and even the private sector. I think it would be naive of us if we didn't also raise alarm bells about what has happened in the PIC. And of course, Chair, if you look at it, the PIC owns about 12.5% of the JSC, has virtually funds in every single listed company in the country. It's the largest investment fund in the continent. We don't think we can allow the PIC to go the route of ESCOM. It would be too big to save, and it would pull the entire economy down. And of course, Chair, the first person to suffer would be your workers. Chair, we've already seen as COSATU that workers are bearing the brunt of corruption in the state-owned enterprises. We're at ESCOM, SABC, SAA, workers are being threatened with retrenchments. We've seen previously, Chair, in Transnet and private sector companies where workers' pension money has been looted, stolen, and those workers were then chucked into poverty without the pensions that they worked decades for. Chair, I must also say that we do have members who sit in the GEPF board, the UAF board, the COIDA boards, and though on paper the PIC counts to them, but the experience of our members who sit on those boards is that that's not the case. They've had to chase time and again after the PIC to explain what have they invested, where have they invested. The PIC will duck and dive. They have at times, like all of us, been shocked to read in the newspapers that PIC has invested 4 billion here, 2 billion here, stuff which it's got nothing to do with the mandate of the GPF and other pension funds.
Can you just tell the Commission what is the representation of COSATU on the Board of Trustees of the GPF?
Sure. The GPF board basically follows the normal pension fund composition, like in the private sector, 50% employer, which is the state, and then 50% employees, which in this case is the unions, selected through the Public Service Collective Bargaining Council. So 50-50 ratio.
Does it comprise of trustees? Do you call them trustees or a board of directors?
It's a Board of Trustees, Mr. Commissioner, in terms of the Act governing the GEPF.
Mr. Parks? Yeah, just two questions from me. Just in terms of the GEPF, you got trustees there, and the process of contracting with the PIC is done through what you call a mandate agreement. And the GEPF trustees, they got the power to put issues there within that contract to ensure that the PIC carries out its functions. And in many ways, if the PIC doesn't perform the functions, you can actually take them to court, and say, this is the contract. I mean, how do you think about it? I mean, why couldn't the GEPF actually do such a thing?
In fact, Chair, we'd be very glad actually if the GPF could be called here and explain that question, because we've got the same questions. It's difficult to find an explanation. Why has the PIC been allowed to run amok, basically? No accountability. What we have heard from our reps who sit in the GPF is that they have struggled through the GPF to call the PIC to account. There seemed to be a complete breakdown of relationships. But also seems that there was basically almost a Wild West type scenario at the PIC where they would just do whatever they want. I think the former CEO had a large signing powers up to about 10 billion rand, if I'm right. But what you've seen in the media is stuff that you cannot in any stretch of the imagination link to a mandate of the GEPF. But I think, Chair, the existing rules might seem okay on paper at face value, but clearly given what we've seen happening, the system is not working and we need to kind of find new ways to reinforce, to strengthen, or to fix breaks in the system.
Just coming back there, because you see, when pension funds deal with asset managers, the mandate is really the key document, so when ShopRite pension funds deal with the Old Mutual asset managers, the only key link with them is the mandate. And if the mandate is not structured properly, you're going to have such problems and all that, So could it be that the mandating process is the biggest problem, or there could be something else?
I think two things, Commissioner. I think you're right, 100% the mandate is the most important issue. And part of one of the things we fought for successfully in the PIC bill at Parliament was for that mandate to be in the bill itself, to say that the PIC must get its mandate from the depositors, the GPF, UAF, COIDA, etc. Because many of the investments you've seen, you can't believe there's any mandate that the PIC received from the GPF. And again, the fact that the GPF board members say they themselves do not know about these investments. But I think the other part of the coin is that also the accountability systems are not in place, they're not strong enough. And to kind of give a parallel example, the existing PIC Act is about 4.5 pages long, governing a 2 trillion rand fund. But your Broadcasting Act, which governs SABC, is about 34 pages long. Now, not that length is a panacea to anything, but it just kind of gives you the extent that much more thought is needed to be put into the governance systems at the PIC, given the size of what's at stake and given what has happened generally across the board.
Thank you. Thanks.
Just perhaps a question, because obviously when one's looking at the PIC bill that has been passed and more broadly, there's also a question that the PIC is bound by the FICE bill, the FICE Act, the Companies Act, a whole lot of other legislation. So the PIC Act should be reflective of those things in addition to what happens and the accountability that is required. That would be the first question. So one shouldn't just look at the PIC Act in and of itself, but perhaps in the broader parameters of all the legislation that the PIC is there, and therefore what is unique to the PIC should be in that Act. It doesn't have to replicate. So the length of it should not be the issue. Does it sufficiently control those areas that are not held to account through other pieces of legislation? So that would be the one question in looking at, a question of it being 4 pages. It might be sufficient, it might not be sufficient. I'm not commenting on the content of it, but just the broader parameter of the legal accountability that the PIC has. And then the second question, which I think is extremely important, because in many ways the mandate that we are seeing both from the PIC and the GEPF, and obviously the GEPF will be coming, there's no question about that, to appear before the Commission, is that the mandate issue is very broad. So if it is support for a developmental state, that can be interpreted in a million ways, as we've seen. And therefore, the question about how that is addressed, both in terms of governance by the board, the trustees, and the voice of the trustees, and the questions that you may well raise in relation to the effectiveness of the trustees and the relationship with the PIC, becomes extremely important, because if the mandate is not defined clearly, then all of these things do fit into the mandate of a developmental state of transformation, these broad, nice-to-have concepts. And then the third thing, whether you've thought about it, because given the size of the fund, roughly 2 trillion rand fund, the allocations of spending or the delegations of authority are, you do have, well, it's been changed subsequent to the Commission sitting. It was a matter of 10 billion before it had to be referred to the board. But when you're looking at it, and it works on percentages, so the question of a percentage, which may be a huge number, given the size of the fund, is regarded as a rounding number in relation to that, and therefore the billions are treated, I would think, fairly loosely. So 6 billion is not material in relation to the total, and yet 6 billion is hugely material. So whether you've considered how that, from the point of view of having trustees on the GEPF, what does percentage mean, an uncapped percentage, in relation to the allocation of funds or the discretionary spend, and whether you have a materiality definition that relates both to the number and the percentage.
Yes. I think a couple of things really kind of alarmed us when we first started having this debate about 2 years ago. When we went through the PIC Act, we felt it was basically a blank check on several fronts. One was that the minister basically had a blank check on how to set up the PIC board. Other boards in the state sector would often have also some criteria, checks and balances, accountability and so on. Here, basically, the minister appoints the PIC board, just has to consult the depositors, to consult cabinet. So a very kind of broad thing. That was kind of worrying for us when you saw media articles about politicians having relatives sitting on the PIC board. The other thing which worried us about the PIC Act is that the minister could issue any directive to the PIC board as long as it was reasonable and rational, if I get the words right. Which again, that's even broader than the definition of a developmental state. Anything can be reasonable and rational, It was quite alarming to us. I think the other thing which also was worrying about the Act, or the silence of the Act, was that there was no specific accountability reporting requirements in it to the depositors, to Parliament, to the public. So huge blank checks. And again, Chair, I think we felt that the PIC is not any normal investment fund. It's the largest investment fund in the continent. It's workers' pension money. It's so huge, and it's quite unbelievable that it's been treated so loosely in that regard. So we'd hope to kind of address all of those kind of gaps that we identified in the PIC bill. We think we've largely managed to, as best as possible, to do that. But even on the mandating issue, again, the PIC Act is largely silent on the mandating issue. So we had kind of negotiated with two insertions in the PIC bill at Parliament. One is to state it, even for stating the obvious, but to state it in the bill, that the PIC must get its mandate from the depositors, because we're not convinced that some of these investments can be justified in a court of law as being based upon a mandate. The second one was to give investment guidelines. Where possible, they should be invested in ways that support a developmental state, job creation, sustainable development, the normal nice things. But we worded it in a way that it's not too rigid or bureaucratic to hamstring the PIC in particular instances. But we wanted to kind of have those checks and balances in place that if someone does go to court, the PIC will be forced to explain what mandate it used and how was it based upon the investment guidelines. Because right now we feel they really are playing fast and loose or treating billions like Smarties or something like that. It's quite worrying. I think, Chair, the other one is that in terms of the delegations of authority, I mean, yes, the percentages might make sense on paper, but given the size of the investment fund, it's worrying. I think for us, we really want to see that there's no blank check for the CEO of any amount. There must always be a committee which must authorize every investment. I think the minute we do it with percentages, we're just opening up. Maybe to give a similar example, Commissioners, Parliament just before the elections passed a political party funding bill where political parties must disclose all funding they receive above 100,000 Rand a year. So we were worried that you're going to get some smart chap who's just going to come and now donate 99,000 Rand and escape the transparency clauses. So we will really be keen that every single cent the PIC spends, whether it's listed or unlisted, there must be a system to approve it, not one person or not two persons, and everything must be disclosed to the public, to government, to Parliament, to the depositors. So in short, Commissioner, we really not want to see any uncapped spending. It might make things a little bit more bureaucratic at times, the PIC, but I think given that what's at stake, you need to do that, and for just reasons, Chair.
I'm sorry to interrupt you again. I know it's making it very difficult for you to do your presentation. But on that score, a worrying thing for me personally is, and you're saying you want representation on the PIC board to look after the workers' money. We have a situation now that the GEPF gave millions to a company, Harith, investing in Africa in PIDF1 and PIDF2. Have you got any, or is there a request for representation on the board of Harith? Is there a reporting structure for those funds to report to the GEPF? Isn't there a bigger risk? Actually, that's my question.
Perhaps I could just ask, in addition to what you've said, Advocate Libber, is given that you have a board of trustees representing with worker representation on that, and decisions taken to invest directly, what accountability does the GEP have to its members apart from the PIC? So that if we take those examples of investment abroad, which are direct decisions, then they're not the only ones where the GEPF has invested significant monies directly, not via the PIC. Have you found that your representation on the board of trustees has enabled you to hold the GEPF accountable in that circumstance? Or is it also a question that you are not sure what happened to those funds, or are they getting returned, are they being serviced? What is actually and what is the decision-making process that the union representation would say, this is something we are satisfied with, it's been through the process to make that investment? as distinct from using the PIC, which the legislation is about, but there you have the representation. And are there lessons to be learned from that representation that could be applicable to decision-making in the PIC itself, as to regard reporting, accountability process of such investments being made?
Yeah, so I think the first question, look, on the representation on the company boards, I think we've often found out, by the way, that the PIC will be entitled to representation on this company or that company. And then you find that PIC has failed to exercise that right. We were quite shocked when it was reported in Parliament last year that the PIC was not even exercising its rights to attend the Steinhoff board meetings after the explosion. It really seemed to be a dereliction of duty. We haven't had the same amount of problems with the GEPF. By and large, things seem to have been flowing a bit smoother there. Might be because you've got a 50-50 employer-employee relationship there. Might have better investment committees and so on. May just be luck. But I think, Chair, I mean, our stance as COSATU is that we wouldn't want to rest upon good luck or trust or friendship. I think we want to really see on all fronts, maximizing the transparency and accountability requirements, checks and balances, the public scrutiny, as much as possible. Because things can be okay today, but a year down the road, there's a new CEO who may not be so honest, and then you will find yourself into trouble. So I think, yeah, the more things we can do to strengthen it, the better, Chair. That's kind of been our approach around the PIC bill itself, just to look at the maximized public scrutiny and accountability on all fronts, Chair.
Follow-up question? Sorry, yeah, sorry to get there back. Just in terms of trying to put more legs in the process of investment, you are saying, you know, the committees must look at investments and approve everything. The problem is this, is that, you see, when you deal with banks and other private sector companies, whenever there are good transactions, they've said that those are done by the banks and other companies because the PIC processes are too long, you know. And this makes the PIC not get what you call A-grade deals or the choicest deals, you know. So if you're going to prolong this period of 6 months now going to 9 months to do a transaction or 7 months, it's not going to be sort of beneficial for both the PIC and the GEPF. And stock markets really move, you know, so very quickly and all that, you know, I mean, markets can move 30% in 2 months or so. So how do you think that will affect the flexibility of the PIC? That's the first question.
Yeah, look, I mean, I guess there's always a question of finding the right balance, the right equilibrium. We don't think this thing should take 6 months, 9 months. But on the other hand, we would be much more worried about what we've seen that's happened to date, where the former CEO was given a blank check. And it seems we've all become a little bit numb when you just read a story about a 4 billion rand, some investment you couldn't understand what it is, just lost. Not once, not twice, but a couple dozen times. Some of the things look so bad, Chair, that they look like nothing less than money laundering fronts, you know. So I think, Chair, we would really want to err on the side of caution that this is workers' pension money. There must be some administrative process they can do. So it's not 9 months, 6 months. It can be fast enough for the needs of the stock market, but it can be done in a way that's sustainable, that prevents looting. Chair, we've had engagements, for example, on the Edcon deal, which we did within a few months, where between the UAF, the PIC, government, the private sector, the banks, it was a deal worth about 3 billion rand. It was done within a few months, but it was done transparently, openly, in the public domain, etc. So we think you can do it, Chair. We'll be worried if the PIC needed to have a 24-hour thing where they can just go and buy a shopping center. These are huge investments. They must do their due diligence. I don't think they should be allowed any massive shortcuts. They really need to, given what's happened, to be kept as accountable as possible.
Next one is on the follow-up too. You see, when you look at sort of global benchmarks, many pension funds, whether it's CalPERS in California, whether it's the Canadian pension funds, they outsource fund management, and they never really sit on the board of the companies. So you find that what they do is that the pension fund itself, like GEPF, will have stringent rules about transparency, about mandating processes, and proper mandate. But you will never see the pension fund owners sitting in those asset management companies. And I just want to get your comment. I mean, when you look at NUMSA, they have a provident fund, and they outsource that money to asset managers, but they never really sit on the board of those asset management companies. You know.
Yeah, no, in fact, I'm glad you raised the California example, because that also came up during the parliamentary engagements. At one stage when we were discussing requiring the PIC to disclose all listed and unlisted investments, the PIC told us, no, that will result in speculation, manipulation of shares, etc., etc. Then we found the California teachers example, where they disclose listed investments within 24 hours. So we think there are good examples that we can use. Look, a lot of workers' pension funds have been looted in the past when they've been outsourced. The Fidentias are an example. It is outsourced to a private company, it's gone. Workers at Transnet also experienced the monies being looted previously as well. So there's too many examples of that happening. And I think right now we're in a situation where workers' trust in the PIC and in government to manage the pension money, the insurance money, has been badly damaged. We had a COSATU CEC meeting, Central Executive Committee meeting of COSATU in September 2017, where the then Finance Minister, Malusi Gigaba, came to us and said he cannot guarantee that he won't use the PIC money to bail out the SOEs. And that was at the height of state capture, long before the commissions came to try to clean things up. And that time you had a situation where SAA, SABC, Denel, ESCOM, even ministers to fund normal ministerial funding projects like free education, even the Minister of Health for NHI funding, all wanted to use the PIC money. We were very worried that there's really no sense of getting a mandate from the depositors. That mandate is, it's neither here nor there. And at this rate, it's going to become a piggy bank for everybody to fund good stuff and bad stuff. So, Chair, I think basically our workers are feeling that their trust has been abused for far too long. They really want to have representation on the PIC board. The feeling is that this is workers' money. It's workers' pension funds, it's workers' unemployment and injury and duty insurance. The norm in the private sector is a 50-50 representation between employer and employee, but that we're in a special circumstance and they want to have a say. So part of the compromise we made at Parliament during our engagements with the MPs was that we had proposed initially a 50-50 representation. The argument raised to us by government, by the MPs, that look, it's not strictly a pension fund board, the PIC, even though 87% of the money is pension money. So the compromise we then reached was that to have 3 union representations on the PIC board, and that they would be selected by the Public Service Bargaining Council. That was raised deliberately, Chair. So it wasn't a question of a minister sitting in his office with a friend. You're a union shop steward, but I know you come from a very small union of 200 members. I can easily manipulate you, bribe you, whatever, bully you. So the argument we had made, and which the MPs had agreed to, was that the Public Service Bargaining Council, as a statutory body which represents public service workers and unions, would be selecting 3 reps. 2 would come from the majority federation, the PSABC, and 1 from minority. Again, we raised that because we wanted to maximize the oversight. So it shouldn't just be a question of COSATU sitting there, but let's have FUDUSA as well, so we watch each other at all times. Because it's very easy to bribe one person, so we really wanted to maximize in a systematic way, Chair. But I think really, in a nutshell, Chair, there's a need to repair the relationship between workers and the PIC and the state. I can't speak on behalf of FUDUSA, but what I can say is that FUDUSA's Public Service Association, that's their largest affiliate, it's the 3rd largest public service union. They've long actually wanted to pull out of the PIC. They said, look, there's too much corruption there, etc. And on an emotional basis, they're right to say that. Our position at COSATU, though, is that we don't want to withdraw the GPF from the PIC. You would collapse the PIC tomorrow if you did that, because 87% of its money is from the GPF. And I think we appreciate the positive developmental role the PIC can play in the economy in terms of transforming it, growing the economy, etc. That you wouldn't have necessarily if you had a strictly outsourced pension management kind of approach to it. But Chair, I think in exchange for that kind of confidence in saving the PIC was for us to also to have ways to tell workers, you can have confidence, you can have trust, you can have an eye on how your money is being spent, a voice in how it's being spent, and just a way of kind of minimizing the looting and preventing it as much as possible, Chair.
Can I ask you just a little bit of elaboration? Because I'm not commenting on worker representation per se, I'm talking about representation, whether it is from workers or anybody else. If you have a board that is at the moment it's not an oversight board, but when one looks at it going forward, and again, I mean, if you looked at it now, the members of the board are part of executive function. So that is one of the considerations that we would have to give going forward. But if you have, and you talk about representation on the board, how does that actually work? Because if you're on the board, your fiduciary duty is to the entity. Is it something that you envisage side agreements that you can report differently? That was one of the things that was raised, that if you actually do, for instance, have a PIC representative on an investee company board, the fiduciary duty is to that investee company. Yet there may well be issues that the PIC needs to be aware of. Do you have a side agreement as a condition of funding? What are the kind of things that you see as representation? Because your issue there has to be the bigger picture. Once you're on the board, it's a bigger picture issue, and your fiduciary duty is to that board. How do you see representation working? There are obviously mechanisms that can be done. It's not that it's not possible. It's just the question of how do you see that representation? Because if you see it as you've got 3 people whose job is to report to you, is that the correct thing? Because then what happens to the big picture? How do you have fiduciary duty within a board in that sense? And have you looked at that? And is it covered sufficiently in your view that there's a duality to that? And did you discuss that at all?
Yeah, Chair, we have spent a lot of time kind of discussing the whole PIC board representation, and there's many kind of pros and cons to different arguments. Conflict of interest, do you have the capacity, is there not duplication, etc. I think, Chair, but because we were living in such a special circumstances, where there was a complete breakdown of trust in the state, workers feeling that their money is no longer safe with the state, whether it's going to be used to bail out SOEs or just be looted or fund government projects. We were in a very difficult, dangerous situation, Chair, where members were almost on the verge of rebelling. They felt we wanted to pull out. So it was part of rebuilding that. It's not a perfect thing, Chair. There will be some conflict of interest, there will be some duplication. But the idea is to have a voice, eyes and ears at the heart of it, at the board, at the oversight level. Not so much to sit on the different company boards. I think the PIC, through its administrative arm, so to speak, must be one sitting on those boards. So we wouldn't want to see us, for example, sitting on Edgar's and so on, but at a macro level to be there. Chair, I think we also looked at international examples as well, in Germany, Sweden and so on, where those kind of models have worked well, of building trust, hearing the voices of workers and pensioners on it, and also towards minimizing the corruption and so on, Chair. But look, we know it's not perfect, and in a normal situation, you might not want to go down that route. But given where we are right now, Chair, we thought you really need to maximize the representation of workers, the eyes and the ears, and try to kind of prevent this kind of behavior as much as possible.
That's why I said I'm not questioning whether there's representation. I'm trying to understand whether you looked at how that would be given effect to, given the duality. But your response is fine. I mean, I don't have a problem with that. It's just for our clarity going forward about what we would have to consider.
But what, excuse me, what would the workers expect? Would they expect from that representation to get a report back as to what's happening at the PIC board?
Maybe afterwards, if the Honourable Commissioner could just unpack the duality debate a little bit for me, in case I didn't answer it completely.
think it relates very much to what Judge Mpati has just asked, is that if you've got representation on the board, do those board members come back and address a COSATU CC or a FEDUSA body or different trade unions, when in actual fact their fiduciary duty may well be not to do that, because in the interest of the PIC it might give information that is particular to the board. And then is it looking only at the representation or interest of the worker, but the interest of the pension funds, but what happens in relation to development, transformation, etc. And is it a question that when I'm saying duality, it's exactly that. Is your accountability within the board and responsibility within the board, or do you have sidelines to give other reports? And I'm not saying that that can't be organized. I'm just asking whether within the expectation of the discussions that you had, there was an understanding that it's not the board that has to account, but your representatives on the board that have to account to you. And that makes it a very different accountability. Yeah, if your representatives have a different accountability to the board as a whole. And it may well be that you say, well, how did this decision get taken? So that would require some mechanisms within the board to ensure that there is a cohesive board that takes accountability as the board, not just, therefore somebody else will say, well, I'm here for business and I talk to business and this one talks to that. So it's that cohesion of a board that takes accountability and is responsible for, as distinct from a representative board where you have people on the boards who represent certain interests. It's a question of, to use as a different example, if you took the South African Reserve Bank Act, where it asks for not representation of business or agriculture, etc., or people, it asks for the members of the board to have knowledge of, and therefore, is your representation reporting back? Is the question that, you look at it, if one looks at the unions, there's a lot of reporting back that is done. Yeah. Therefore, is it an expectation from the elected representatives to report back as distinct from the board reporting back? And I think that's where the duality and the conflict may lie.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Chair, Commissioner. No, look, we're sensitive to that need to to juggle to balance the duality. I think members who currently serve on the UF board, for example, would do that, where the UF also invests funds, etc. And they're specifically, so they're not just chosen by the Minister of Labour because you have expertise in labour issues. It's specifically selected by the COSATU, the FEDUSA, the NACTU, etc., the trade unions. So specifically to bring the expertise, but also that sectoral representation, but also accountability. So I think that's part of the idea. I think obviously, and we had some discussions on it at Parliament, for example, on the reporting mechanisms. There is a need for some kind of confidentiality processes. Because you're investing in listed companies, things can be manipulated either way. So you'd have to get that right. I think, Chair, that's also why we had wanted that the 3 union reps not be chosen by the Minister, but be selected by the unions through the SABC. So it's the constituency itself which chooses them. Again, to have that accountability lines. It may not be perfect, but every little part we think would help assist a bit here and there. And one of the difficulties also we had, Chair, for example, see, workers at least are unionized, or those who are unionized at least are organized. Pensioners, for example, are not organized. It's very difficult to organize pensioners. So they're also a voice left out, but because most of them did come from the unions, you can carry that mandate for them. But they have a huge issue there. I think, Chair, look, as COSATU, why we support the GPF being invested through the PIC is because of the broader public mandate interest as well. And that's why we also pushed hard in the bill to say when the PIC invests that it takes a mandate from the depositors, but also it seeks where possible to invest in ways which grow the economy, sustainable development, job creation, etc. So balancing between the pensioners' interest, but the broader public as well. But obviously must be done in a way which is sustainable for all parties, not in a reckless, dangerous way, Chair. Chair, yeah, I think I'm used to in Parliament a certain type of format which Honourable Commissioner Marcus would be very familiar with. This is a different format to me. So I think, Chair, yeah, maybe I'll try to summarise some of the things. Chair, look, I had mentioned the COSATU CEC meeting in September 2017 when Minister Gigaba had come to us, and there was a long queue of ministers, SOEs wanting to use the PIC to fund everything under the sun, the good and the bad. We were quite alarmed, and we also felt as COSATU that we can't afford to be sleeping on duty. Our members are looking up to us to protect their insurance money, their pension money, and clearly things are not going well. We then engaged with the members of Parliament, with the Standing Committee on Finance, what can be done. They held public hearings with unions, with the PIC, with the GEPF, also civil society organizations as well, the media, to make contributions. Basically, the committee agreed that the PIC Act itself, which had been drafted in 2004, if I'm right, needed to be revised. It was too thin and the circumstances clearly dictated it. So there was extensive process to develop this committee bill, the PIC bill, and all parties were quite involved. We had about 4 or 5 public hearings, 2 years of engagement. So the first part, Chair, is that currently in the PIC Act, the Minister of Finance appoints the PIC board. He just has to consult depositors, consult cabinet, but consultation is a very non-binding word. It doesn't have much meaning to it. Our point there, as the debate we already had, was about the need for union representation there. So I think I don't need to go into that too much. I think it's kind of, we've discussed it already. The other concern, Chair, around the PIC Act is that the ministerial directives, that a minister's got huge powers. He can just simply issue a directive to the PIC, which is just, it's mind-boggling. We're not sure what went on in the minds of Treasury when they drafted that bill 15 years ago, even though we were in the honeymoon phase of democracy at that time. But it's mind-boggling that you could allow a minister to have such huge powers to issue a directive. And it simply only has to be is reasonable and rational. Doesn't even have to be disclosed to Parliament. The other
Can I come in there on the stuff about directives? This issue came up when you spoke about bonuses, because the minister, issued a directive on cutting bonuses there. How would you like to see this? I mean, would you like the Act to abolish this section on directives, or change it a bit, or amend it a bit, or lay out things that the minister can direct on?
I think sorry, Dyke, I just wanted to check if I heard the first question right, the bonuses. They're referring to the public service bonuses.
No. One of the things that happened was there was a directive from the Minister of Finance about cutting bonuses at the PIC, and that has caused a lot of issues and all that. So I just wanted to know from you, how would you like to see this directive issue being tackled? Because I know it's section 4 or something of the Act. How
Section 6.4.
Section 6, yeah. Sort of have you guys applied your mind to this section?
I think the first one about the bonuses, look, as a trade union, we will just ask government to follow the normal public service HR processes of consulting employees, the normal kind of collective bargaining approaches. Our concern, Chair, around the directives was that the Act was so vague that the minister, it is basically 2 sentences. The minister can issue a directive, just be rational and reasonable. Well, I think in the public interest, I think it says that. So our feeling, Chair, and what we had managed to get into the bill was that, one, that whatever the PIC does must be based upon the mandate of the depositors, and also must follow, where possible, the investment guidelines. So it can't just be a minister saying, invest in this shop because my girlfriend owns it, or my future girlfriend, whatever, There has to be some kind of link to the depositor's mandate, the investment guidelines. I think, Chair, the other issue is that we had put in the bill that any ministerial directives must be reported to Parliament in the reports of the PIC annually, must be reported to government as the PIC reports to Treasury as the shareholder, so to speak. It must also be reported to the depositors because it is their money. And then lastly, Chair, was that it must be available on the PIC website so that the public, the media, anybody can see it. So again, Chair, what we want to basically is have maximum transparency and accountability on it. The Minister can issue directives, but must be within these guidelines, and it must be disclosed for everyone to see.
So can I just ask you on that, why do you think the Minister should be able to issue directives if you've got a board and you've got an executive that is accountable? Why should the Minister be able to, and in law, empowered to issue directives?
I think, Chair, two things. I think one, we felt that there may be exceptional circumstances, a natural disaster or something like that, which requires...
But then you need to have a definition as to when
Sure.
that is applicable, so that the bill should then say, in these circumstances, there's an extraordinary power granted to the Minister because it's a defined benefit fund. I just am asking because from what I read of the bill that has been passed by Parliament, it's accepted that the Minister can issue directives. And yet that should not, my question would be, did you consider whether in fact that is appropriate at all? Or if there are, it's got to be special circumstances that are defined. But there doesn't seem to be any measure other than reporting about it, but not a measure of questioning it.
Yes, Chairman, I think we would agree, Honourable Commissioner, fully that that's a weakness in the bill, in the Act, and that it actually should be strengthened and specify what are the circumstances that it's allowed for. I must say, Chair, maybe in a bit of context, that we were basically a lone voice at Parliament throughout the whole bill process. We had to compromise on many fronts. Sometimes we're not completely happy, but because we're basically being hammered on all sides.
Is that how the camel got developed?
The camel.
Cooks produced a camel.
Oh. There's even such a thing as camel milk in the Middle East.
Now highly sought after for its nutritional value.
Yes. No, but yes, Chair. No, I think in short, we'd agree with the Commissioner completely that if you're going to have ministerial directives, they must be specified what's the conditions. And I think you could look at other acts where they do kind of specify the circumstances. So, for example, in the National Credit Amendment Bill that was passed recently by Parliament, the Minister of Trade and Industry can designate a sector because it's a disaster zone, there's economic calamity, a natural disaster, something like that. But I think even then you would still need to have some kind of regulations within the PIC to say, okay, in those circumstances, this is how you manage it. So it's not just a question of the CEO going to the office and pulling out 10 billion rand petty cash or something like that.
And did you at all, when you were looking at drafting a bill, consider whether in fact there should be a defined benefit fund or whether it's a defined contribution, given the move to defined contributions? Was there any discussion about, given, once you're amending the legislation, look at the PIC in totality. It's because what didn't come through to me on the bill, and it's not because one's opposed to implementing the bill. I just think there are a lot of issues that have come out, and therefore one needs to look at the legislation not only for what has occurred, but what has not occurred, and creating a legislative frame that it's trying to fix problem A may have unintended consequences. So the question for me was there discussion about a defined contribution at all, or was it simply assumed that it would continue as a defined benefit? And then secondly, as to whether, if we look at the complexity and the range, was that discussed in the drafting of the bill, and certainly among COSATU, given the range of investment? You mentioned property portfolio, unlisted, listed, on the continent. Is there appropriate to have one board, or is it appropriate to have boards that have different skills and different roles with an oversight board in some form? Was there a discussion about whether in actual fact the requirement of different skills requires subsets to legislation that would perhaps look at a structure and organization that is slightly different? Was it only looking at how do we plug the holes? Because that's my impression from the bill, is how do we stop what's going on, but not necessarily what would be the best way to manage this whole thing. Be wrong in that. It might be something that was considered and said, for the moment, this is what we think we should do.
Chair, I don't think you'd be wrong at all. It was largely about plugging holes. It was, the height of the state capture era, where even at Parliament we would be hammered from left to right for even daring to raise the issue of corruption and to accuse the state of having been involved, etc. So it was about that. And there was a lot of compromises. I wouldn't be lying to say that almost every single word in the PIC bill came about as a fight. Every single point. It might seem kind of benign issues, standard issues that the PIC should account to Parliament, nothing earth-shattering. It should disclose what it invests, sounds normal. But every single point became a fight. So it was about taking what you could get, fighting for the most important things, but also knowing that the Commission is coming and is going to further enrich the governance model and the legislation. So in one sense, it was a bit of a transitional bill to say, can we try to plug the holes as much as possible now, get some core principles achieved. And amazingly, Chair, we had to fight for every single one of those core principles. We were hit on all sides. At one stage, the PIC didn't want to disclose to Parliament unlisted investments. And it took the former Deputy Minister of Finance, SABC Jonas, to instruct the PIC to do exactly that. The PIC didn't want to include in the bill having to report on unlisted investments. It was literally a fight all the time. Even at the end, they didn't want to include the depositor mandate or the investment guidelines. Yet when they would report to Parliament, they'd always say, we take our mandate from depositors, we support the same investment guidelines, but just don't put it in writing. Which really leads you to say, something is very funny here. Why would you support this but not want to see it in black and white? Chair, look, we didn't really have, to be honest, much discussion about the kind of splitting of the boards. I think our own worry would be about possible fragmenting of the PIC, that you need a strong kind of central authority, which can also have negatives as well if it's corrupted. But I think we've kind of been a little bit apprehensive given how the cabinet over the past 10 years was fragmented often. That you had a kind of duplication of departments, yet 3 or 4 economic departments, a couple education, a couple communication. So I think we'd prefer more to see different subcommittees to look at different themes, have representation, have the skill sets that you require on it. Then, Chair, the other question about the defined benefit, defined contribution. Look, the former Minister Nene tried to raise that issue with us. For us, it was a point of don't enter that debate, where I think he would want to have seen that the GPF moved to a defined contributions situation like you have in the private sector. I think if Treasury wants to do that, they must go and engage the Public Service Bargaining Council. But also bear in mind, Chair, that also that your other benefits that invest in the PIC, like your UAF, COIDA, those are on contribution basis, how much credit you've built up, etc., what's available, your income levels, and so on. So it's a bit of a catch-22. But look, if you were to have a defined benefit debate, you would have to have that with the GPF and its own act, etc., whereas the PIC more is the vehicle to invest in, Chair. Yeah.
Just to say a quick point that many people around the world still prefer defined benefit funds, isn't it? In the sense that there is less risk that, your pension will dissipate if markets don't do well, because the government will always come through.
No, you're 110% right. Especially often those persons who, the GPF members, they don't have huge resources. There's teachers, nurses earning 200,000 Rand a year, police officers. So they do want that security. Often those persons are persons who join the public service for life, for 40 years. But I also think, Chair, people are also scarred by what happens in the stock market with your retirement annuities. When Minister Nene was fired for the first time, we lost about, was it 500 billion Rand on the stock market? That devastated workers' pensions left and right. So, but look, you also accept that the state also benefits well, because when the PIC is invested well, it grows. It gives the state more capacity, more resources. So it is a bit of a compromise that benefits both parties if it's done properly and done well. But I think the fear is that if you go completely to the contribution thing, workers will really be at risk that they'll hit the pension age and those, especially the low-income workers, will really be left in dire poverty afterwards.
It's a quick one to follow up there is that, you know, when you look at the PIC, the way it invests, the bulk of the money is on the stock exchange, all right? And even within there, it is in index trackers, both the shares and the bonds, okay? So there is not, besides stock market risks, there is not too much risk because it's index-based. And the unlisted part of the PIC is only 5% of the PIC, where we see the biggest problems. You know, we talk about the looting, which is quite important, but does it make some sense to say that the biggest problem is only in a very small portion of the fund, and the bulk of the fund, you can't do much about it, you cannot manipulate it? Because you see, the main worry is that when people read newspapers, they see that there's so much looting, and that looting is within the 5%. Then it becomes, you know, they lose context and think that 95% of the fund is in danger. Whilst broadly, that isn't the case.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I would agree 100%, Commissioner.
Asking a question, I'm just asking a question, yes.
Sure. Look, I think a couple of things. Maybe to give an example. So I have a retirement annuity in addition to my pension fund. I check on it once a year. When Minister Nene was fired for the first time, I checked on it, and I checked in the following year. The following year it was worth less than it was worth the previous year, despite my monthly contributions. And it was simply because of the collapse when Minister Nene was fired. Workers literally lost hundreds of millions of rands for no fault of their own. But I think even beyond that, so maybe that's just one example. But you see what's happening right now at Tongaat, where they've had to be taken off the JSC. There's serious stuff, allegations raised there. Sign off on the JSC, but workers' pensions have been lost. So our fear, Chair, is that things may not all be all right in the JSC as well, in the private sector. And you remember, Chair, that even our friends, the Guptas, who also wanted to list on the JSC. So there's serious risk there, Chair. I think the other point is that, look, we think the PIC also plays beyond making profit on the stock market and benefiting, I don't want to use this term, white monopoly capital, it's kind of a vulgar term, but anyway. So you don't just benefit the wealthy companies, that the PIC can invest in emerging companies. Some of them might be listed, some might be unlisted, but the point is to always have as much transparency and accountability mechanisms as possible, Chair. Our members have raised concern in our unions about the PIC investing too much in shopping centres, for example, or speculative investments. They want to see investment ways which will actually benefit not just the pensioners, but also the broader public. Growing new industries, growing the clothing industry or whatever industries, not just simply taking the easy route and investing on the stock market all the time, Chair.
Chair, sorry to interrupt. Are you going to take a tea adjournment or shall we continue?
Yes, I think I'd want to take the tea adjournment. 15 minutes from now, say around 20 past.
Thank you, Chair.
representative. But we did accept the motivation of the ANC around it being a defined benefit, the state's liability to come and protect it. But also, Chair, I don't think we were convinced by the argument completely in the end that an independent chair may be a panacea, as we've seen in many SOEs and private sector companies. There was an interesting proposal raised in the Standing Committee of Finance as it adopted the bill at the end. It's not in the bill, but they had raised it as a proposal, was that perhaps you want to have a deputy chair of the PIC board who would be an independent person. So you get a bit of a compromise between the deputy minister chairing it, but you've got a deputy chair who is independent, so to speak. The other compromise made, Chair, was that, see, the practice has been, I'm guessing since Honourable Commissioner Marcus's time, that the DM for Finance chairs the board. The Minister and Treasurer raised an issue, what happens if the DM for Finance has a conflict of interest or whatever the situation might be. The bill was then amended to say, if not the Deputy Minister of Finance, any other Deputy Minister in the economic cluster in consultation with Cabinet. So to give the Minister some leeway if he feels he can't appoint his DM for Finance. But Chair, yeah, look, we were comfortable with the ANC's arguments, and I think for us what really held value was that we think you can hold a DM more accountable through Parliament than purely an independent person, Chair.
I must say, I failed to understand that argument. If there is a provision in the bill that the chairperson of the PIC is accountable to Parliament, he must appear before Parliament, what is the problem?
I think, Chair, look, we were informed by practice where we had independent chairs of the parastatals and they were simply not accountable to Parliament. It might have been the political atmosphere at the time, but that is what kind of informed our experiences, where you had a SAA board chair who just simply refused to come time and again.
Thank you, Commissioner. I just want to point out to you, we're not trying here to cross-examine or to discredit you. The purpose of my questions and that of the Commission is to really assist the Commission to make the correct findings and recommendations to the President. And it seems to me, in retrospect, if I listen to you, that your compromise on the chairperson of the board was a political compromise. If you look at it purely, objectively and practically, isn't it better to have an independent chairperson of the PIC board? If you look at the nature of that board being, in plain lay terms, actually the broker of the GEPF and the funds of the workers.
Okay. No, thanks, Chair. No, look, we definitely take it in that spirit. I think our whole point of coming here today was trying to share our views and to enrich the final recommendations of the Commission. Look, Chair, I mean, to be honest with you, Advocate Luba is correct. It is part of a compromise. Our key issues really was around the union representation, self-selected, around the transparency and accountability requirements of the PIC to Parliament, etc., and also around the investment mandate and guidelines. So those for us were the kind of the key issues. So we did accept that, for example, to compromise here and there, so as part of the negotiation process of the ANC with the MPs, that's part of the negotiations. But I think, Chair, look, for us, it's not a matter of life and death around who chairs it. I think for us, really, it's about the systems, the accountability, the checks and balances. We know with having a politician, there will be some who would validly argue that, hey, you're creating a risk here, politicians have got conflicts of interest, etc. On the negative, on the positive side, we think there is some merit in the argument that it's more easy to hold a DM accountable to Parliament. Chair, I think also that, yeah, we might say independent chair might be less politically conflicted, which would be true, but we also have seen that even those independent chairs are not necessarily independent. Maybe one needs to then look at the process for appointing the chairperson. Initially there was two bills at Parliament. There was the committee drafted bill, which is this one, which was adopted. There was a private member's bill, which also drafted. It did look at kind of more the public protector kind of option of having a parliamentary process, interviews, applications, etc., and so on. But look, I think for us, as Advocate Luba was saying, we did make a compromise as part of the negotiation process. What is most important for us, we focused on that. Here we did see some merit, and so we were willing to compromise on it. But it's not a matter of life and death for us, Chair. We would still feel a DM is a bit stronger person to hold accountable, but we're also not going to to march on union buildings, for example, if you don't appoint the DM. Our issue really was on the other points.
The question I would ask in relation to it, I don't think, I mean, a lot of the things are not a matter of life and death, and in the end you've got neither life nor death. So the only thing that is certain is death, so let's not go there. I think the points made about the concerns are absolutely valid, but the question is that, and that's from the point of view of what we need to consider. If there is, if you like, a defiance, whether it is a deputy minister or an independent chair or the process to appoint a chair, when we talk independent, it's not independent in the absolute. It's a chair that is not part of the political structure. The question should be, does your bill or your legislation have sufficient weight and accountability that should a person not appear before Parliament, you have the ability not only to subpoena them, but to actually do a whole lot of range of consequence. Therefore, it shouldn't matter whether that person is a deputy minister or somebody else, because you need to have the legal weight that says, in defiance of this, you are then breaking the law, and there's consequence to that. And that's what matters, is if somebody, to me, is when one looks at this, that person has to be accountable in the totality. So the points made about what the concerns are, I think, are valid. The answer that it needs to be a deputy minister has its own instabilities, and I think that that might be necessary to look at, is that the PIC is a complex organization. If a deputy minister is under pressure to do certain things, does that find its way into the way it's chaired? Are we looking at how frequently a deputy minister may or may not hold office at the whim of the president or at the discretion of the president? So there's an introduction of a different kind of accountability. If, for instance, we took what has happened up to now, and you've got a deputy minister chairing who comes under political pressure to do certain things, they're under much more pressure. So there's pros and cons to both, and I think it should be a question that says the person that is chosen to be the chair should be on their expertise, their ability to chair, their ability to understand the issues that are there. Because you're a deputy minister doesn't mean you understand markets and those things. Doesn't matter which deputy minister you are, because these are highly specialized areas. So the question for me would be, what are the criteria that should be developed, maybe even as a subset, to say when you're appointing a chair to a body like the PIC, these are the skills that you require and these are the competencies you require. And therefore the appointment should be measured against those two criteria, not whether you come as a deputy minister or whether you're an independent in an absolute. Because I don't think there is such a thing with the chair. The chair is bound by the law of the PIC and other acts. And therefore, it is something that, there are ways around addressing these concerns, which is about accountability and responsibility. And I would just use the one example. You've had a succession of deputy ministers as chairs, and yet the PIC has been in complete violation of its own memorandum of incorporation, and nothing has been done about it. It's been allowed to function in that way, with good or variations, because you've had 3 or 4 ministers, deputy ministers chairing in that period, and yet a core element like the MOI was violated. So to me, it would be much more a question than whether it's a deputy minister and you can hold them accountable. Is your law strong enough to make that accountability possible? Is there clarity on the role and function and skill and expertise that's required in a chair of a body of this nature? And that may not be in the legislation, as we've said before. A lot of things come into regulation and appendices or practices to say this is what needs to be taken into account by the person appointing the chair to the board, because it isn't only the chair. So I would just be a little bit cautious about the approach taken and saying you can hold it more accountable, because if you're saying you can hold the deputy minister as a chair more accountable, it means the legislation that you have governing the PIC may not be strong enough.
Just to add a final point, from my side on this issue is that if you look at global benchmarking on this issue, is that one example is the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. they got is the oil fund, they used to call it, they got $1 trillion. It's $1 trillion fund. So that's like 14 trillion rands, you know. And they tried to remove it. They actually took it away from the Minister of Finance and they put it within the central bank. And mainly because the central bank in Norway is the most independent entity where politicians cannot interfere within that particular fund. So, I mean, political independence probably is quite a big thing, and I think in Singapore they also do such things, but within Norway, they've actually put it within the central bank, that fund, to make sure it's just run by sort of professional managers.
Yes, no, thanks, Commissioner. Look, I think we would agree on all fronts that there is merit on all points. I think for us also kind of choosing what is the least difficult situation. And I take Honourable Commissioner Marcus's point about the cabinet reshuffles, that it creates a contradiction, because you've got a board which is there for a few years, and you have a minister who can change at 1 o'clock in the morning for any reason. And though hopefully we'll pass that era. Chair, I think that's also why we kind of focus a lot of our efforts on the reporting requirements, to say that the PIC has to report on everything, all investments, listed, unlisted, all ministerial directives, not just to government as a shareholder, but also to Parliament, to the depositors, but also we went down to the detail that they must publish those reports on the PIC website. So any journalist can sit anywhere, because, you know, it's difficult sometimes to go through 200-page, 500-page reports. So let's make it as transparent as possible. That's where we really focus our energy. Chair, I think we did find some validity in the proposal by the Standing Committee on Finance, though it wasn't in the bill, about having a deputy chair. That maybe one chair would be independent, and that one would be the DM, for example, as part of kind of an equilibrium, so to speak. But I think maybe one last point, Chair, also that, so as COSATU, we got involved in the whole package to save EdCon at the beginning of this year, to save jobs, the spillover effect into the economy, etc., through our reps on the UAF board. Obviously, they had to do their own due diligence to check is it a financially viable intervention, etc. We found it very difficult to engage with the PIC, to the extent that the acting CEO and other PIC officials wouldn't answer phone calls, wouldn't respond to emails, etc. And not that we were asking them to break laws or to cut corners, but just asking them to do the work, but with a bit of time pressures, because literally EdCon, which had about 40,000 jobs at stake directly and another 100,000 indirectly, there was a ticking time clock. You find the PIC just simply refuses to respond. So our point is that, look, this is workers' money. We want to save workers' jobs here. We don't want to benefit myself or my friend, but just do something positive for the economy in a transparent legal mechanism. What assisted us greatly, Chair, and why I'm mentioning it, is that we were able to engage directly with the Deputy Minister for Finance, Mondli Gugubeli, at the time, to say, look, the UF has done its work, the bank's on board, we're on board, EdCon is on board, but the PIC isn't even moving to the extent of calling the investment committee to look at the application, all the normal due diligence they had to do, literally chasing. It was at least helpful to us to be able to phone the deputy minister and say, look, can you, not ask them to break the law, but can they just do their work properly and do it timeously, because it's not a normal situation. So our fear, Chair, is that, and look, not to say that an independent chair can't also be contactable, but you need to have some kind of way that constituencies can raise their voices and say, look, we need help on this issue, you know? And at least we felt with the DM that we were able to literally harass them on a daily basis to say, we've got 2 weeks left to save EdCon, it's important to workers. So I think that is for us one kind of useful point of having a DM to chair it. Not that everybody under the sun has got access to a DM, but at least we felt there's a bit of a way of interacting and to put pressure in a legitimate way, Chair.
But taking that in a slightly different context, surely it is something that its mandate and the role of the GEPF is something which could also exert pressure where you've got. Secondly, in many boards, you would also have as a balance, which, you know, a deputy chair has a different function from a lead independent director. And the question for me would be, a counterbalance is often a strong person on the board who is the independent director that the board members and others can go to when the chair is not functioning the way they should. So quite often that may well be a different stabilization or balancing strength to have a lead independent director on your board. And again, that relates to whether the board is a governance board or an executive board, because if your board is a governance board, it holds the CEO accountable for the very things that you're saying did not happen, which ought to be something that you've got various pressure points. If that was occurring, and the PIC is not doing that, let's take it at a different level. What is the consequence of not doing certain things that actually need to be acted timeously on? And therefore, it's not whether there was a call for the PIC to act in a particular way, but what repercussions were there for that board not acting. So the legislation and the structure needs to ensure that ability to have these, if you like, different levels of of stopgap or stops that you can say that's not good enough, and the repercussions. So it's a mixed bag about whether it should be a deputy minister or not. I'm just concerned about the continuity, the choice of the person who may be an appropriate deputy minister but not an appropriate chair of a body like this, and the time taken. This isn't a part-time job. So there's a lot of factors that we would want to consider in the views that you've expressed, recognizing the imperatives, but also recognizing what is the most appropriate, taking account of the problems we've had. Because don't forget, on paper, everything is there. It's the practice that has been the problem.
Can I add, just to add as your answer there, don't you think one of the biggest problems, it's not even about choosing the DM as a chairperson, but it's more about the mandating processes, systems, checks and balances, as you said, that maybe more concentration should be placed on that issue to make sure that these things are well oiled, and so that's the big thing that maybe one should concentrate on in terms of the processes. And second point is that if you take your point that you guys have been trying to speak to the PIC, they don't answer questions or phone calls and everything, I mean, it might seem that there is no legal channels for stakeholders, to address the PIC if they are feeling that they got problems. So then it seems that there could be an issue of addressing stakeholder management in a way that maybe through some legal channels like the Act or other measures to make sure that the stakeholders' voice gets heard. Yeah?
But doesn't the stakeholders' voice get heard through the GEPF? Isn't it a matter of the reporting lines that you are a step away, well, 2 steps away from the PIC, and so you get the second-hand report from the GEPF, isn't it?
Yeah. No, I think, Chair, yeah, I mean, we would look forward to the Commission's coming with recommendations. I think maybe it might also need to balance on the issue. There is a need to have a voice for the state, for example, on the board. The state's got a vested interest as it's a defined benefit. If there's a shortfall of 25 billion rand, as one projection was saying, that's poses a significant risk to the state. It might be that, Chair, maybe as Honourable Commissioner is saying, that you have a governance board, then you've got an executive board, which will help to kind of balance the two. But I think you would need to find some kind of method or space for the state to be represented there. Chair, it's a difficult one because I think all sides really do have valid arguments. I must say, as COSATU, we have had quite a few bad experiences with independent chairs who just maybe were scarred because of the last 9 years at many, many parastatals who just literally ran amok and ran those SOEs into the ground. It's a difficult one because I think all sides really on this issue have valid arguments. What's the kind of maybe the approach chair is to maximize the benefits, to have a strong voice for the state as a defined benefit, have the independent expertise, because it is a valid point that what skills and experience and competency does a politician bring? But you do need to have those voices, Chair. I don't think we really also want to say it because one doesn't come from the state, therefore one is a panacea of good governance, ethics, skills. We've seen many times in our SOEs, we've got private sector people on board, and they've been the worst thing ever. And again, Chair, there are some DMs who have been very good DMs as well. But I think, Chair, as the Honourable Commissioner was saying, that the approach we really focused on was about the mandating systems, the checks and balances, the transparency, as much as possible. Because even if you get Deputy Minister X, he may be good, but there might still be issues. So we really wanted not to put all our eggs in one basket, but spread as much as possible across on all fronts. But you're right. I mean, our frustration has been about a lack of legal avenues. So we further, for example, on the UF board, we have a voice. We're able then to ask the UF board to meet to discuss an issue. They might reject our proposals, but at least they meet. But with the PIC, it literally became almost a comical circus. I've been told every week, no, they're going to meet next week, and they never meet. In the meantime, we were on the verge of a jobs bloodbath. And again, members will say, but this is workers' pension money, why don't you have a say? Why don't you have powers to influence the systems, It's as if you're just some kind of person on the street and your voice is completely irrelevant, Chair. And look, Chair, I think maybe the last point is that, yes, the GPF, theoretically, it's there, but clearly the system hasn't worked. And the fact that GPF members themselves say they would have to chase after the PIC to get reports. They would really read stuff in the newspapers for the first time and be shocked that it partly might indicate also, Chair, that the fact that the CEO had signing powers of 10 billion rand. And those are huge amounts of money, Chairperson.
My last point, which I want to raise with you, Mr. Parks, is the representation of the union members on the board of the PIC. Now, I share the concern of your members about the way the money is spent. But the purpose of legislation is to legislate not for the exception or the abnormal. So let's take a normal situation, hopefully. We have a situation where there is strong representation of workers on the GEPF Board of Trustees. Is that correct? You agree with that? Just answer that.
Sorry. Yes.
So what is needed is for the Board of Trustees of the GEPF to do their job. If they give a mandate to the PIC, it must ensure that it is properly worded and that the mandator, the PIC, are properly instructed how to spend the money. And if in that mandate there is also a provision that the PIC must report properly and regularly to the Board of the Trustees, then in a normal situation, it seems to me, it would be unnecessary for the workers to be represented on the board of the PIC. I understand your argument that this is now exceptional circumstances, but I also understand the argument that the only reason you are now insisting on that representation is because of the abnormal situation. Am I correct or incorrect?
Thanks, Chair. Look, for COSATU, this has really been one of the kind of most contentious, most emotional, most important parts of the debate. COSATU has been raising it for many years, not just on the PIC board, but other boards as well, SABC, other ones where workers are involved. I think we raised it much more firmly in the last 2 years when we saw what is going on. And I think, look, for workers, it's a very emotional debate, that workers are paying thousands of rands every month, hard-earned wages. It's going here, but they've got no say, no voice, no eyes and ears, how it's being spent, how is it being managed. And I think, Chair, yes, if we were in Norway, where things are not crazy, where we didn't have finance ministers being fired at 1 o'clock in the morning because of very dubious reasons. Sure. I don't think we're out of the woods yet. I don't think we'll be out of the woods anytime soon. Yes, we've got the president cleaning up, but I think, Chair, our approach right now will be to plan for the worst, no longer to rely upon trust or friendship or comradeship, especially when it comes to workers' monies. So for workers, it's a very emotional thing. I'm sure emotions have got their values, but the trust has been badly eroded, badly damaged by our very own comrades, you know. So I think it's part of rebuilding that relationship. And I must say, Chair, look, as COSATU, we've been the one in the Public Service Bargaining Council saying, let's defend the PIC, let's keep the GPF in the PIC. Fiducia was the other way, saying let's withdraw, let's pull out, and that would collapse the PIC. The PIC would lose 87% of its assets immediately. So it's about building that trust, Chair, and I think it's a reasonable request that to say, we're investing 2 trillion rand, but can we have a representation, not even 50%, just 3 out of the 13 board members, and whatever requirements you want them to be accountants, lawyers, whatever, it's fine, we'll provide that. But I think, Chair, it's about building that trust relationship. It's going to take a long time to build. Even if you get those 3 persons, it's going to take some time to rebuild it. And it became kind of a point of irritation, almost humiliation for unions at Parliament, because we were bashed from pillar to post by all the MPs, even the ANC MPs, saying, no, unions, you don't know anything. You don't know how to invest, you're corrupt, you're chaos, you will bankrupt this thing. But yet, it's on the very watch of Treasury and the state and Parliament, the boards, that chaos has been allowed to kind of reign there. Chair, I think, and look, we've raised this on other boards as well, to have a voice for workers. There's good international examples in Germany and Sweden where you have, as part of building the trust relationship between management and workers, you have that voice of workers. I think VW has that example, for example. Japan does it. So it's not just us as COSATU pushing socialist revolutionary theories, etc. It's a good precedent around the world. But yeah, Chair, I mean, it comes down to that. Workers want to have a voice in how the money is being spent, and it might be, as Commissioner Marcus is saying, that you have a governance board, and then you've got an executive board. But clearly the system that's there right now hasn't been working. Otherwise, you wouldn't have had the situation where the GAPF boards say, we don't know about these things. We're not getting reports. We don't have a voice.
So just for clarity, I'm only using it as examples. The Commission has not considered what type of board or what different board roles could be. It was just using it as an example. And perhaps just 2 questions that arise. How, given all of these issues, does COSATU and the other unions, because this isn't only applicable to COSATU, obviously union representation, this is public service unions, but is there a circumstance in which you're on both sides of the coin? If you are represented on the GPF and you're on the PIC, but your investment arms are a part of various consortiums. We've seen quite a bit of publicity about 1 or 2 of them, and they're not the only ones. You have 3 legs having different roles. Is there a policy that you have around sitting on the board and being a recipient of PIC money through your investment arm? And does that create conflicts as board representatives if you're giving the accountability to say we're investing in this and you're part of understanding that investment, but you also know that your investment arm is part of that particular deal? How do you deal with that when you have, and I'm not arguing against worker representation, I'm asking for the framework within which that needs to be in place to ensure that there isn't a conflictual mandate from GEPF sitting on the board taking a decision and the beneficiary being a union investment arm part of a consortium in a particular deal. Have you thought about that? And then just one other point on your page 16, which while there are lots of things in your statement that I would not agree with necessarily, but this one I just feel I would like to raise is that the Commission, it's the 3rd paragraph down, the Commission was appointed by the President and is thus an extension of the Executive. This is an independent judicial commission. It is not part of the executive, and it is not accountable in that way. It is here to be and publicly accountable. Obviously, its report will go to the president, but it is not an extension of the executive. I just think that that needs to be made clear. Okay.
Okay. I think in terms of the first point, the conflict of interest, look, that'll definitely weigh heavily, and at the PIC needs to have very strong regulations that manage that. I don't think there'll ever be a situation where there wouldn't be someone with a conflict of interest. If the PIC owns 12.5% of the JSE, almost every single listed company, we'll always have an interest. So PIC owns shares at Woolworths, Markham's, etc., for Shini's. We've got members there. Members might also own their own shares there as well. So I don't think we can run away from that, but I think we want to see us in the regulations as strong as possible ways to deal with disclosures of interest, how to manage conflicts of interest as well, because it is a very tricky thing to balance all the time. So that's
not just, sorry, just in that, does it not then require disclosure by organizations, whether they're union representatives or not, of their investments in different consortiums? So that if you are, I mean, because the question needs to be, the way I would see it, is if organization X is being funded, whether listed or unlisted, it's being funded, usually unlisted, because that's where your consortiums come in as part of your BE deals and part of other functions. Is there not a disclosure requirement as to what the consortium is before the decision is taken by the PIC, so that it knows whether any of its board members have are an interest in that particular deal? And again, it would relate to whether the board is a governance board or a part of an executive function. So, you know, there are ways of managing it. I'm just asking whether in your own considerations you've given thought to how you as unions, as being part of ensuring that you look after your own members as well in COSATU funding, have considered what disclosure is required on your part in any of this, and whether that found its way into the legislation so that you have accountability from all parties in transparency.
No, thanks, Chair. In fact, it is quite a heated point of discussion for us that we've been debating back and forth. It's quite a difficult thing, and often at times some unions get it right, do fantastic work, are able to invest, grow workers' pension money, in fact, even raise money for the children of workers to go and study at universities. Some of them do fantastic work. Others, it's very worrying, the kind of stuff that gets along. And I think largely it's because of the issue of lack of governance, lack of disclosures, checks and balances. So I think there we'd want to see as much checks and balances, disclosures as possible. The more the better. You can't have too much disclosures. And look, it's not an easy thing, because at times even as COSATU, we've been embarrassed that our investment fund has done some stuff which we're not aware of, which put us into a contradiction. So I think even from our own benefit, the more transparency and checks and balances, the better. Obviously being sensitive to the stock market debates and all that kind of stuff, but we would want to side on the part of caution to have as maximum disclosure and transparency for our own benefit as well. Chair, I think also one thing we've been pushing for at Parliament, and I saw ANC's been proposing a little bit, I saw the Western Cape Provincial Government also said it's going to do it now, is a question of audits and lifestyle audits. I think it would be a good thing to require in the regulations of the PIC, all board members, all subcommittee members undergo lifestyle audits, and you can even include that broader to investment audits, so to speak. So you minimize the opportunities for conflicts of interest. Because otherwise the temptation will be very great. I sit on this committee, we're discussing billions of rands. It's not much for me to make a phone call to someone and say, look, give me 20 million and I'll make you happy, you know? I think that's what's basically been happening. I think, Chair, also I forgot to mention the union representation issue. We really had been at loggerheads with Treasury and all three Ministers of Finance, from Kigaba to Nene to Boeni, around union representation. And I must say, on a positive note, that about 4 weeks ago, the Minister of Finance, Tito Mboweni, wrote to the Public Service Bargaining Council, asked the unions there, as per the PIC bill, to avail 3 representatives, 2 from the Majority Federation, COSATU, 1 from the Minority Federation, FEDUSA. So we took that as a gesture of good faith and as part of the process of rebuilding trust and so on, which had been badly damaged over the years, Chair. I think, Chair, in terms of the last point about the independence of the Commission, so I was a bit of a delicate, and I had to review some of my wording because at times when we made previous submissions to Parliament, things were very hot, very, very hot. Look, I think maybe to say without flattering the commissioners, we were very pleased who had been appointed to the Commission. Yourself, Chair, Commissioner Marcus, and so on, as persons of integrity, which gave us confidence in the Commission. I think we're pleased with the work the Commission has done. So we didn't really have any doubt in the Commission or to impugn the Commission's reputation or integrity. But I think, Chair, from our side, we had gone through a 2-year plus process at Parliament where every single word in the PIC bill was literally a Stalingrad battle, where we had to fight for every single point. We were insulted, chased, called crazy things by members from the ANC and from other parties. Every point, the union representation, the disclosures, directives, listed, unlisted, every single point we were attacked. I had never, Chair, I've been in Parliament for about 20 years, I'd never seen this kind of covert resistance to a bill that I saw with this bill. That in a committee meeting, everybody would be happy. Afterwards, there'll be phone calls made by very senior people telling the MPs to stop this bill. We would also be told, you know what, why don't you just stop this bill? We can discuss some deal as a PIC with you, you know? And Chair, the more that happened, the more it really raised alarm bells. We met all 3 finance ministers, and all of them came with a different story about why we must stop the bill, long before the Commission was even thought of. So every month there was a different story, all of them creative. So we were quite alarmed the Tuesday in February, when the National Assembly was going to adopt the bill. Even that was a huge fight to get it through. Then we were told on Tuesday that the Minister of Finance had written to Parliament and cited a letter by the PIC Commission that Parliament should stop the bill because the PIC Commission is busy with the same issue, which on face value that makes sense. But given the kind of the background of 2 years, the kind of behind the scenes shenanigans, it really raised alarm bells. Parliament then, I was told, sought legal advice from Parliament's legal advisors, who strongly cautioned the MPs not to delay the bill because they're saying it's a committee bill, it's not an executive bill. So it's a different type of bill. And if you allow the executive to tell the Parliament what to do, you're setting a very dangerous precedence going forward that they can do the same thing again. So I think that was the kind of, that is the background to our fears and our anxieties. And Chair, if it had just been once off, sure, but every step of the way, even to the extent that Nene had told us in August last year, no, don't worry, the Commission will be done by October, you know? And first, Chair, we just really saw a huge amount of dishonesty by different parties. I think with the part of Treasury, we don't believe Treasury is corrupt. We don't believe Minister Mbweni is corrupt. I think for us, our analysis is more that it's about protecting their territory. This is a committee bill. Treasury doesn't like to see committees getting ahead of themselves. They want to control things very tightly. I think they're worried that next thing committees will be amending taxes, so on. I think maybe one commissioner who used to be a chair of SCOF in Parliament many years ago might relate to that experience. So we don't doubt Treasury's integrity. I think more it's about territory. On the other hand, Chair, there are people in the PIC who are clearly very corrupt and who really latched on every little excuse to try to collapse the bill. And they literally threw everything at us. And we had to really ask, but what is so wrong with requiring the PIC to account to Parliament or to have a few workers representing there or to disclose your investments? What's so shocking about it? So I think in conclusion, that's what kind of really informed our context. It was not to lobby stones at the Honourable Commissioners, but to kind of give the sense to the Commission that this is not a kind of a new process or innocent process. It's a very contested one, Chair.
We're still waiting for your concession that this is an independent commission.
No, I'll concede that gladly, Chairperson.
Just another question before we shift away from this slide. Board selection. So in terms of that, I just want some views from to see whether you sort of have some views there. What we have seen is that, I mean, there are 3 models to choose a board, really broadly, what has been seen. You can have an opaque process where just the minister decides, and you know, like we've seen with the ESCOM board, the PIC board. And then you can have, on the other side, on the extreme, you can have a very open process like the SABC, you know, where people appear in parliament and all that. And then you got the third model, which is what happened with SARS when they appointed the new SARS CEO, where the president convened a panel, and it was a closed process, but in the end, we managed, the Treasury put out the documentation where they showed us why they chose the CEO and all that, and people could read and see the process. So have you thought about how to select the board, say, given those three models, the extremes on the sides and the one in the middle with the SARS appointment?
Yeah, I think, Chair, I mean, look, for us, what was really shocking in the beginning of the whole process was the blank check given to the minister. It really, it just doesn't even set a limit for, there's nothing, just, it's a blank check. Just consult depositors cabinet, and as long as you're in compliance with the Fires Act, that's it. I think, I mean, your SABC board has got more requirements, you know. There's not even requirements around skills, etc. So I think for us, that was the first point, is that it has to be fixed. The current system doesn't work. So we wouldn't want to keep the current opaque process. I think where we agreed with colleagues is that you must have the skills and competencies. You can't just appoint friends and family, must be people who have got skills and competencies. Then in the beginning there was two bills. There was the private members bill, which provided for that kind of parliamentary process, that Parliament would have public hearings, interviews, etc. And there was the committee one, which said, look, the minister will appoint, except for the 3 union reps, which will be selected by the PSCBC. Look, for us, what is most important was the issue of the union representation. We weren't violently for or against the different other models for the other persons. But we wanted to really see that the worker representatives would be selected by workers, not by ministers or not by MPs. Because if you said the whole board must be selected by Parliament, then you lose that element of worker control. So the whole point about the 3 union reps is that would be selected by the unions, the PSCBC, a statutory body, and hence accountable to them. Whether or not the other board members were selected by the minister or a parliamentary process type, or the SARS type approaches, for us it was neither here nor there, but it was really the focus on union representation. I mean, there is merit to how the president appointed the head of the National Prosecuting Authority really recently, that helped build public confidence in it, which was quite a master stroke on his part to have an inclusive process, etc. Similarly with SARS. So yeah, Chair, for us, it was neither here nor there. Whether it was that type NPA approach or a parliamentary approach is fine. For us, really was about the union representation and the worker-selected representatives. Other points we could compromise. But I mean, Chair, I think as long as the principles of transparency, accountability, skills, and competency are there, the main thing is that the current act is just shockingly inadequate, Chairperson. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. That concludes the evidence of Mr. Parks. I'm indebted to him for the frank debate and discussion on the topics, and I trust it will assist the Commission in its findings and recommendations to the President.
Just a few questions on investments. I think you have made some on slide 10. On slide 10. The first thing I wanted to ask you was the conundrum about investing locally versus global investments. People saying the argument, you know, they make some arguments about investing globally. One being you get access to tech companies like Apple and Google and the others. And you get exposed to economies which are growing much faster than our growth here. and then of course long-term sort of currency risks, given that we're an emerging market, you know. So what do you think, I mean, if you look at global pension funds, they're like 20-30% offshore. The Norwegian fund is like, because it's a small economy in Norway, they're about more than like 50% of their money is in other countries, you know, to avoid risk. What's your thinking there? What's COSATU's thinking there?
No, thanks, Chair. I think for us it was maybe two key points. Maybe the simpler one is that what we've seen right now, some of the investments by the PIC simply defy any logic, whether investment logic or benefit to members. So I think that's what we put in the slide 10. You'll see the exact wording from the bill, which seeks to give investment guidelines. We had done it deliberately, Chair. So if you find that later the PIC has invested 2 billion rand in buying me a car, the PIC can be taken to court and they must justify how does that investment match what's on paper in the law to kind of avoid this kind of laissez-faire approach right now where anything went. I think that's the one point. Then I think in terms of the local versus international, and we know, look, you have to get a bit of a balance. I think for us, number one is about the security and the sustainability of members' investments, the GPF, the UF, etc. It has to be secure. That's the number one mandate. But look, Chair, we have 37% unemployment. Every month we see thousands of workers being retrenched across all sectors of the economy. We're starving for investment. The President has been forced to run around the world to try to attract more foreign investment to us. Yet we've got 2 trillion rand, the largest investment fund on the continent. So we think really we need to get the right balance. We're more comfortable not with the 50-50 ratio like Norway, as an extreme example. We're more comfortable with the kind of the current 80, 90%, 20, 10%, you know, basically 80% local, or if not 90% local, 10% overseas. The ones that go overseas must really be closely scrutinized to be of benefit, because some of the ones have been very dubious. But Chair, look, I think for us, while we're also kind of keen to keep the GPF in the PIC, is that this is a huge opportunity to grow the economy, to industrialize it, to create new jobs. One of the reasons why I also don't want to see it only being investing in the well-established companies on the JSC is that we need to diversify the economy. It's not sustainable for us to have 37% of workers unemployed. We cannot keep having the only economy in the townships being taxis and spaza shops. We really need to diversify the economy, to non-racialize it, to create new opportunities, but in a responsible, mature, rational approach. So I think for us that's really the thing. We have been a bit frustrated at times with the PIC. We felt it's gone too far for the things like shopping centers. Should do more to invest in local industries like clothing, auto manufacturing, etc., where we are convinced you can make money. We'd want to see them doing investments in things, for example, like renewable energy, water conservation, where you can meet multiple goals like sustainable development, but also protecting jobs. There is space. We don't think South Africa is a Mickey Mouse economy. It's a very diversified, industrialized economy. There's ample opportunities, we think, for the PIC to make money locally, which will create jobs, etc., Chair. But look, Chair, it's maybe one last kind of example. The UIF Act allows the UF, for example, to invest in ways to create and protect existing jobs, to avoid people being retrenched and then having to go and queue for unemployment checks. So there's a kind of a balance that the more workers you have employed, the less pressure, for example, you put on the UF. The more workers you employ, the less pressure you put on public servants who on average support about 7 unemployed persons. It also assists pensioners who don't have to support unemployed relatives as well. So I think really we're quite passionate about investing locally, and we think there's huge opportunity to do so, Chair, if the PIC is governed properly.
So what would you know, am I hearing you saying that the PIC should sell some shares on the JSE and invest in more unlisted companies, and also sell some shares and invest in the global market to alleviate the long-term risk of being in one economy? Is what I'm hearing?
Yeah. No, I think, Chair, we think that it's about getting the balance right. They must do all three. But I think first is the proportionality of it. it's fine to listen to the JSC, but also let's see how we can create new economies, new jobs. And there really is huge opportunities. But if we're just conservative and say, no, I'm only investing in the JSC listed companies, you might miss out on other opportunities, for example, to invest in water conservation. Huge opportunities to create thousands of jobs there, especially for the most poor, the most least skilled persons, etc. But look, Chair, I think, for us what was really important was to get the principles right, that you have this mixed bag, but the bias must be towards the local economy, towards industrialization, towards job creation. But you will see, Chair, that all the wording there has been done in a way which it puts the onus on the PIC to do it in this way. But if, for example, it's not physically possible, for whatever circumstance, there is a way to manage that process as well. So you don't kind of tie them down in a bureaucratic corner, for example, Chair. Thanks.
Just, Advocate Libber, the statement by Mr. Parks, is it signed?
Yeah, I have a signed
The
statement.
one that you've got. What is the status of the appendix? I see that SACP says they support the COSATU, supports COSATU and Public Investment Corporation. It's an unsigned document. What do we do with it? Just read it? Is it just there for our information?
It is for information purposes. We'll just have the official documents before the Commission is the signed statement.
Yes.
And the PowerPoint presentation is just an addition to that.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Parks. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for making yourself available to come and testify before us. You've given us quite a bit of information, and quite a bit of, I don't know whether to call it recommendations as to what we should consider. We certainly will consider all the matters that you've placed before us, and thanks a lot. You may be excused. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Commissioner, this is unfortunately the business for the day. I had other witnesses lined up for today, but we had late withdrawal, so unfortunately I cannot continue today. We'll start at 10 tomorrow.
Yes, the Commission will then adjourn until 10 tomorrow morning.
Thank you.